Well, good afternoon, or whatever it is for some of you. Good evening, good morning, and welcome to the Herbert C. Kelman seminar. And I am really so happy that all of you have chosen to come and be with us today. And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that the Herbert C. Kelman seminar is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs here at Harvard and the Program on Negotiation at the Harvard Law School. And we are really grateful that you've taken the time out of your busy schedules to be with us today. And we wanted to just let you know that also that the seminar is being recorded. So if any of you want to come back and take a look at it in a couple of days, my team will be posting it on the PON website, Program on Negotiation website. So check in a few days if you'd like to see the recording. And also the Q&A session, when Pam Steiner, Dr. Pam Steiner, is finished with her remarks, we're going to open up the seminar to questions and answers. And if you would, please don't put your questions in the chat function, put it in the Q&A function, because it's just much easier for us to monitor. And I'd also, before we move on, also like to thank the team here who has worked so hard to get the seminar going. Diane Long, Anna Chang, Nicole Bryant, and James Kerwin. We're all in this together, and I want to thank everybody for all their efforts. And also would love to thank Herbert C. Kelman, who is listening in today. We're just delighted that he's here with us. I know Dr. Pam Steiner is really happy too that he's here, because she and Professor Kelman have gone back a long time. In fact, he was her dissertation advisor. Anyway, she can tell you more about that. But today we have Dr. Pam Steiner here, and the title of her talk is Conflict Resolution Practice in Light of Collective Trauma and Power Asymmetries. And again, I just want to let you know, all of you, that this is a remarkable presentation that Pam is giving. This is basically her life's work. She has worked very, very hard on these issues. And I'm just thrilled that she's here to share her insights with us. She's also written a book, which we're going to put in the chat section, the name, in case you are interested in obtaining the book. But Dr. Pam Steiner has convened and facilitated conflict resolution workshops for Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, and for Armenians and Turks. She is also a trauma psychologist and group psychotherapist in private practice. She is a great-granddaughter of Henry Morgenthau, the US ambassador to the Ottoman Empire from 1914 to 1916, serving in Constantinople, Istanbul, just before and during the most intense period of destruction of the Armenian people by the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman government. Morgenthau, her great-great-grandfather, became and remains today a hero to the Armenian people due to his persistent efforts to prevent the annihilation intended for them. Dr. Steiner is a senior fellow at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard at the T.H. Chan School of Public Health. So again, thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. And I'm going to turn this over now to Dr. Pam Steiner.
Thank you, Donna, so much for that great introduction. Thank you, Herb Kelman, for decades of inspiration, guidance, and friendship. Thank you, friends and associates of the Program on Negotiation, for the honor of speaking here today and for great tech assistance. And thank you, other friends and family, for help as I put this presentation together. To those attending the Zoom event, whether or not we personally know each other, I see us all as part of a wide conflict resolution community. It's a community that's been essential to the evolution of my thinking, and I am grateful and indebted to you. Now, most of what I will say here today comes out of my conflict resolution and psychotherapy practices. I've been looking forward to giving this talk. It will be sober, although a little less than it might have been given President Biden's wonderful confirmation. The Ottoman Empire's last government did indeed carry out a genocide of the Armenian people. How should civil society build on this great news? The first requirement is surely to establish the right diagnosis of the problem and of its recent progression before prescribing treatment. My talk will propose 3 additions to the practice of non-official conflict resolution as presented in my just published book, Collective Trauma and the Armenian Genocide, Armenian, Turkish, and Azerbaijani Relations since 1839. The proposals are based on my diagnosis of the role of collective trauma in the long history of these people's power relations. Our field of conflict resolution, I am certain, is critical to the forward movement of the interdependent values of productive conflict and human rights. These inspiring values energize our work, but do not change the reality of how difficult it is to practice. It demands great sensitivity to extraordinary suffering, sophisticated knowledge of different kinds, and significant, but hard to secure, time and funding. As a result of such demands, I ask you to consider whether our ambitions for transforming the relationships of people in terrible conflicts have become too constrained without our even realizing it. I believe so. I will propose then that we revisit our initial hopes and ambitions and find ways to expand our practice to incorporate my 3 bold proposed additions to be simultaneously deployed. First slide, please. The first addition concerns and all of them concern the kind of trauma is humanly caused collective trauma. Although collective trauma is very often named by journalists, historians, and other analysts, they do not generally explore what that means, what its implications are. We who practice conflict resolution need to ensure that collective trauma and its implications are understood and worked with, perhaps by teaming up in our work with trauma psychotherapists. Second, we need to work with narratives that include clearly known important facts in context. We need to know the hopeful possibilities put forward at the time of the events in response to these events and why they were not taken up. With such information, we can better ensure that more weight is assigned to established facts and less to narratives that have either been slanted in unnecessary ignorance or deliberately distorted. Please know that I am not saying that progress in improving relations does not require appreciative knowledge of suffering and understanding each other's experience and perspective on it. Emotionally empathic response is unquestionably a basic need for whatever transformed into understandings individuals or peoples might be able to achieve, even though such empathic understanding need not necessarily always be offered by the perpetrator to the victim. As important, progress in troubled collective relationships equally requires acknowledgement of established major facts. Third, we need to muster the informed support of large numbers of people whose better relations we aim to help achieve, as well as the values of productive conflict and human rights. Trauma-informed conflict resolution can provide the core of such outreach. And as 4 says, my 4th point on this slide, to have a major impact, we need to make sure all of these steps are taken more or less simultaneously, in which case I think they have a chance of a major impact on the entrenched powers. So before discussing these proposed additions further, which I will, I would like to tell you my motives for undertaking this book. They were a mix of duty, discouragement, pessimism, even despair, and a mix of excitement and hope. I trace my duty to the values of my family of origin and to my wonderful education. In this book, I've used that education, formal and otherwise, to honor the legacy of Henry Morgenthau, my great-grandfather, as Donna said, the US ambassador to the Ottoman Empire during the early stage of the genocide of the Armenian people. He made many notable efforts to stop it. Now to my own discouragement. I first learned about the field of conflict resolution and its practice when a doctoral student of Professor Kelman. We read and discussed, of course, but we were also taught experientially. That is, we students got to be junior facilitators in workshops whose participants were influential Israeli Jews and Palestinians. After graduation, colleagues and I continued to use that approach. We were among countless individuals and organizations at many levels who for decades held small dialogue workshops and meetings of influential Israeli Jews and Palestinians in order to help resolve their relations. In spite of so much effort for so long by so many, that relationship, although less violent today, is actually less justly and sustainably resolved. This was discouraging and remains so to a patriotic dissident Jew like myself. At the time when I felt so pessimistic about change in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I decided optimistically and naively to tackle the Armenian-Turkish situation as well. This decision came about quite fortuitously. Next slide, please, Anna. One day in 2004, Roger Hagopian, an Armenian-American filmmaker and rug cleaner from Watertown, was cleaning rugs in our home in next door Cambridge. I showed him this family photo. He was thrilled to see Morgenthau, one of his heroes, and to meet me, one of Morgenthau's great-granddaughters. I told him about my work in conflict resolution, and he then introduced me to the National Association of Armenian Studies and Research in nearby Belmont. So that's how I came to enter the intense and fascinating learning curve demanded by efforts to try to resolve this conflict. I am not of Armenian or Turkish background. While I have personally experienced trauma, and as a psychotherapist worked with individuals who are traumatized by very different kinds of events, neither they nor I had knowingly been exposed to genocide that was denied by the government of the people that perpetrated it. Thus, I took a long time to appreciate the depths of fear, pain, and exhaustion and anger of the Armenians in their relationship with Turks. The years went by. I came to feel discouraged about the likelihood of just and sustainable resolution in the Armenian-Turkish situation too. I was coming to the conviction that we practitioners of conflict resolution were failing to identify and take account by name of two seminal baseline realities for which we need the accurate language. And those seminal baseline realities are the existence, the immense existence of repeated collective traumas and the existence, therefore, of collective traumatization. I found that I could no longer imagine how the extraordinary transformative promise of our work could be realized without acknowledgement of and attention to these realities. Instead, I anticipated that the exercise of power of one people over another or each over each other would continue as it has. Now I realize that spending so many years on the Armenian, Turkish, and Azerbaijani relationship was invaluable, exactly because the problems are so extreme and throw a clear light on what I came to believe is so needed in the practice of conflict resolution. Next slide, please. So here they are again, and I'm going to speak to each proposed addition now. Collective trauma first. The common understanding of trauma is accurate as far as it goes. An individual or a people goes through a harrowing, terrifying, horrifying, overwhelming event and is scarred thereafter, often for life. They transmit the trauma to later generations. I needed a much more filled out understanding of trauma than that. And now I'll explain it simplified, some tentatively, and too generalized. There is more to learn about trauma. Next slide, please, Anna. As I got into writing about trauma in the first chapters of my book, most of the time, I found that the following fundamental distinction held and enabled more clarity than not. So I use the word trauma primarily to designate real events occurring in the material, real world, outside the human psyche. In contrast, I use the word traumatization to designate individuals or people's inner experience of the traumatic event. Being traumatized then refers to the state of our psyches, our minds. That is what is meant by psychological trauma. Now, certain events can appear to traumatize most people, but to very different degrees and ways, depending on many individual and environmental factors. Traumatic events and the internal state of being traumatized are common, but very common. But because most people do not seek treatment, far more of us are probably traumatized than studies show. Yet, not everyone who has experienced a traumatic event becomes traumatized, or so it may appear. 9/11 was a collective trauma and seems to have affected all Americans, but not necessarily traumatized them. But we don't know. What we do know is that factors determining the degree and type of trauma symptoms, which I'll talk about in a moment, include age, relationship to the perpetrator, and prior experience. But again, certain events seem to traumatize just about everyone, though it just cannot be overemphasized in different degrees and ways. Next slide, Anna, please. There is also agreement by all investigators that while undergoing a traumatic event, everyone's brains respond in instance and involuntarily with compelled impulses to save themselves by fighting, fleeing, or freezing. One trauma healing method I use in my psychotherapy practice stresses that these impulses are compelled by energy we mobilize at the time to repel or escape the threat. The very first impulse on which we are instantaneously mobilized to act is to fight the threat if we can. If we cannot, we are compelled to run away or flee from it. If we cannot flee, we are compelled to freeze, meaning we become still and quiet, like non-human animals, terrified but unable to save themselves by fighting or fleeing. We stop moving, hide, or blend into our surroundings. Although these instantaneous involuntary reactions or responses originate in our brains, we experience them in our bodies, emotions, and thoughts. Consider the phrase, "I was scared to death." It identifies an emotion, fear, and a thought of death. In a book I just finished reading about man-eating tigers, the author identifies people who are facing such a tiger with the following words: limbs and vocal cords are paralyzed with fear. Another common phrase is frozen in place. Another, I trembled like a leaf. The leaf metaphor identifies shaking, a common bodily reaction when experiencing great anxiety under traumatic threat. At the collective level, we speak of frozen conflicts and situations of mutually assured destruction, both phrases referring to living under massive traumatic threats. If a traumatic event or threat traumatizes us, then we have trauma symptoms. Clinicians label reactions as trauma symptoms only after some months post the event, hence the phrase post-traumatic stress, as in PTS. Trauma symptoms are repressed memories and often repetitious, such as nightmares and intrusive thoughts. or reactions of prior actions, even though the latter may not be literal repeats of the traumatic experience, whether subtly or dramatically. Trauma symptoms commonly show up when things remind us of the event or trigger us. We can be triggered both from the outside and from the inside, as with nightmares and intrusive thoughts. Reminders trigger all or some of the same reactions as during the event. Some bodily symptoms are very obvious, like rapid breathing or heart rate. Others are observable only to a trained observer, at least at first. Unprocessed memories also show up in emotional volatility, avoidance of pain, emotionally painful reminders, and distorted, extreme, or muddled thoughts. All are normal to abnormal events, or what we like to think of as abnormal events. Trauma symptoms express what our bodies, emotions, and minds retain of the traumatic experience then, and they form mostly or completely out of our unconscious memories of the experience. They're unconscious because the experience was overwhelming, unbearable, too much for our conscious minds to absorb, and they are not integrated into our ordinary consciousness, i.e., into our conscious personal or collective narratives. Thus, memories of having been traumatized dwell, metaphorically speaking, in their own separate space inside us. They are unintegrated into our mind's narratives, to which we do have conscious access. There is wide agreement that being traumatized interferes with use of our most mature cognitive and emotional capacities, especially predictably with regard to the traumatic event or reminders. And I'm building up to my examples. For example, among the things that happen as life goes on is that traumatized individuals or peoples alike, or their descendants to whom a trauma has been transmitted, may not distinguish past events from present triggers or new events. It should be no surprise to hear me say that trauma symptoms are disruptive and don't aid our functioning. There's an important twist to this entire dynamic. As life has gone on, traumatized individuals or peoples may have acquired more power than they possessed at the time of the traumatic event. So while under threat again, they will be triggered to instantaneously choose between fight, flee, or freeze. But instead of fleeing or freezing as before, they now may choose to fight and take revenge on the original perpetrator or scapegoat an innocent party, or a sort of innocent party, or mostly. In some, the prior victim may now perpetrate. In international affairs, one traumatized party may misperceive and overreact against a challenging, weaker one. They may justify such actions to the point of committing genocide. In contrast, untraumatized individuals or peoples have found ways to accomplish the uncomfortable and difficult work of processing traumatic events, and they retain just traces of their extreme reactivity in their bodies, emotions, and minds. Their memories have been integrated into their personal narrative or that of their peoples. They resume use of their most mature and emotional capacities and intellectual capacities in making decisions. If what I've been saying about the effects of trauma sounds far-fetched or exaggerated, let's consider some manifestations of unprocessed collective trauma in the Armenian and Turkish peoples and Azerbaijanis. This brings into our discussion the second major addition I propose for conflict resolution practice. That is, the need to work with narratives based on important facts in historical context, and so informing all parties' narratives. First, then, some historical context of the relationship among Armenians, Turks, and Azerbaijanis. Many chapters in my book cover this history, so what I will now say is a very potted version. Slide 6, Anna, please. From millennia before the Common Era, the Armenian people inhabited much of the territory that the Turkic people conquered some centuries into that Common Era. This territory ultimately formed the lands of the Ottoman Empire. By the early 19th century, the Christian Armenians and other non-Muslims lived under severely discriminatory Ottoman rule and pressed for better treatment. Some important progress was made. By 1908, the Ottoman government ruled under a liberal constitution in which the Armenians had the same rights as Muslims. Armenians elected members to the parliament and received many promises for improved conditions. Yet Armenians continued to be subject to large massacres and other serious discriminations, and they continued to pressure the Ottoman government for their rights. Shortly before the start of the First World War, and 6 years later, the Ottoman Empire had just, I'm sorry, it's not 6 years later. Well, it's shortly before the start of the Ottoman First World War, which was 6 years later, in 1914. So shortly before that, the Ottoman Empire had just lost highly valued territories they had fought for in 2 unsuccessful Balkan wars. Imperial rulers were traumatized and rightly feared for imperial survival. Their ongoing fears then reflected these and other pre-war traumatizing experiences that these same leading rulers of this government and 2 who would become their worst henchmen had had. A chapter of my book goes into how these men's experiences relate to the empire's declining status, how they were linked to rationales for those years later carrying out genocides on Christian Ottoman citizens. What this entire situation threatened for them, perhaps most profoundly, was the unbearable loss of their proclaimed inherent Muslim superiority over non-Muslims. And this was a very psychological sense they had of themselves. Let us note that while Ottoman rulers feared that the demands of the Armenians for their constitutional rights would be the final decisive nail in the empire's coffin, leading loyal Armenians vocalized the opposite sentiment, that is, that awarding them their rights would preserve the empire. When the Ottoman Empire became then a party in the First World War, it brought more poverty, disease, and massive losses to all classes and ethnic groups of Ottoman citizens. Then in 1915, still very early in that war, the Ottomans' exaggerated fears and intransigence against awarding Armenians their constitutional rights led them to initiate genocidal massacres to deal decisively what the Armenian community then called the Armenian question. In doing so, the Ottomans also inflicted great moral injury, a trauma symptom, on themselves, evidence for which I'll present in a moment. 4 years later, the Central Powers, inclusive of the Ottomans, had lost the war. Nonetheless, the Turkish people as a whole came out with much more power than the few surviving members of the Armenian people remaining in the empire. Those Armenians who could had fled abroad or to the South Caucasus. Next slide, please. Why to the South Caucasus? As well as the territory that had become Ottoman, the Armenian people had also, since time immemorial, continuously inhabited adjoining territory in the South Caucasus. All the Armenian inhabited territory in the region was originally then one unit, and it was the Armenian homeland. It was labeled Armenia on maps. In the South Caucasus, that homeland included the territory of Karabakh, also known as Artsakh, in which Azerbaijanis also lived with pride. The Armenians and the Muslim Azeri people were then neighbors. It was over Karabakh that the 44-day war of late 2020, utterly disastrous for Armenians, took place. Since the beginning of the 20th century, relations between Armenians and Azerbaijanis have often been violent and included large-scale massacres. The status of Karabakh has been unsettled for much of that period. Today, the number of Armenians in the region is very small, and their power far less than that of the Turkish and Azerbaijani states. Now, that's the briefest background for what I will now say about these people's present-day symptoms of collective trauma. Armenians in the South Caucasus have partially but significantly denied their relative weakness out of their emotional dysregulation, denied to themselves, a trauma symptom. Emotional dysregulation is a trauma symptom. And they had that from experiencing such shocking, unbearable, and overwhelming, utterly traumatizing losses in the genocide, and from many other blows, including decades of shocking denial by those who imposed the losses. Armenians have also demonstrated determined sustaining resilience, but it has simultaneously served as a costly defense against their true situation in the South Caucasus. The defense helps to account for major decisions based on what they would like to be true about their situation, rather than its reality, resulting in failure to explore and exploit possibilities that might have avoided last year's disastrous war. Might have. For the Turkish people, the major symptom of collective trauma is ongoing self-humiliation and moral injury. To explain, we need to take a brief look back just post-First World War. In 1923, the Republic of Turkey replaced the Ottoman Empire. From then until 1948, successive Turkish governments maintained a distorted narrative of their treatment of the Armenian people. The narrative was that there had been no massacres. Then in 1948, the United Nations Convention Against Genocide was ratified. Thereafter, it was the genocide that Turkish governments denied, even though the convention itself solely exemplified the new term genocide with the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. Turkish denial continued even after Turkey became a signatory to the convention. More recently, continuing to deny genocide, even making denial state policy, Turkish governments no longer maintained that there had been no massacres, but rather that those massacres were an inevitable tragic occurrence in the fog of wartime. The phrase false equivalency refers to the situation when two sides of a story are incorrectly treated as equally valid. Today, Turkey claims that its denial is its side of the story, that it is as valid as the claim of genocide. But the claim is not based upon fact. It is a claim made for other reasons, like tobacco companies' prolonged denial that cigarette smoking was harmful, not because they cared about whether cigarettes were harmless or harmful, but about sales. Why is denial so important to Turkish governments? There are two reasons. One is that during the genocide, when the Armenian people had been expelled from their homes and sent on death marches, or sent and murdered, when the Muslim Turks were then permitted to take, and did take, all the property, every bit of it owned by individual Armenians and much owned by the Armenian community. The government established an elaborate set of legal sounding regulations to cover up this large-scale theft, to make it appear that Armenian property was being safeguarded for the owner's return. One reason for denial, then, is that it has allowed successive Turkish governments to avoid paying any reparations to Armenians. In my book, I record that about 10 years ago, a top Turkish official personally, confidentially confirmed to me that, quote, "We know it was genocide, but we do not want to pay any reparations." I recall sensing some empathic understanding in him for the Armenians, but not that it was about to change his stance. Rather, I think I also sensed some pleasure he had in his role of having so much power. The second reason is the deepest psychologically and the most difficult to process: Turkish humiliation and shame. The second reason for the denial. Moral injury refers to a person's or a collectivity's humiliation and shame after doing something morally repugnant to themselves. Only a few years ago, Turkey's President Erdogan proclaimed in public that there could not have been genocide because, he said, no Muslim could commit such an act. Honor is very important in Turkish culture. The fact of the deliberate denial of the genocide, rather than the fact of the genocide, is what makes official or track one conflict resolution work perhaps impossible. Denial, rather than its repudiation, leaves open the continuation of genocidal policy. And this is no theoretical matter. In 1918, in the last throes of the war, Ottoman armies marched into the eastern South Caucasus, aiming in part to finish off the Armenians there. As stated, and this was stated as an intention by some leading Turks and at least one high-level German military advisor. Thus, given the genocide in the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman military's deadly pursuit of Armenians in 1918 in the South Caucasus, and the threatening statements over the last few years about their territorial aims in the South Caucasus, and finally their alliance with Azerbaijan in the 2020 war, without official Turkish repudiation of the genocidal aim, Armenians live in fear for their lives and collective existence in the South Caucasus. I return now to my despair about resolving conflict without acknowledgement of major historical facts. Regarding the fact of committing genocide, I would welcome being proved wrong, but I believe only New Zealand, regarding the Tasmanian Aboriginals, has voluntarily taken responsibility for commission of genocide. Let's consider Germany after World War II. There is no reason whatsoever to think that Germany would voluntarily have affirmed commission of the Holocaust. But the Nuremberg trials forced it, and accountability slowly followed. But once it did, Germany took responsibility for transforming its culture. I find it discouraging that the international community has so far failed to find a way to compel Turkey to affirm the commission of genocide and to repudiate the genocidal intention as is required in the Genocide Convention. Consider this: without Germany's having been forced to face its crimes, would Nazism have been delegitimized? Would Turkey have credibly assured the world that the country would not repeat such a crime? Would not all Jews everywhere have continued to feel threatened by Germany? Instead, Germany educates its citizens about Nazism and the Holocaust, has placed memorials throughout the country, and paid reparations to Israel. Such actions will not entirely heal the German people's self-inflicted moral injury, but their actions are unquestionably meaningful to them and invariably reassuring to others. Now I will very briefly address my third and last proposed addition to conflict resolution practice and my excitement and hope in writing this book. This particular and final addition to conflict resolution practice aims to add the power of large numbers of those who demand change for constructive conflict and human rights in order to counteract the asymmetries of power between the Armenians, the Turks, and the Azerbaijanis. The proposal is to hold many large, semi-public, non-official meetings, carefully facilitated and planned, not instead of the usual small private workshops, but in addition to them, for over 100 people and held region-wide simultaneously. In my book's last section, I discuss different large group approaches. My three proposals then add up to a package of simultaneously convened multiple large meetings, as well as the familiar small track 2 meetings for fact processing of collective traumas. The Turkish Republic's 100th anniversary is only 2 years away. It's an opportunity for the country to show themselves capable of admitting an historic error. Doing this means revising the founding myth of the Turkish Republic, enabling it to be the honorable leader for the Muslim world, a role that the current Turkish government claims to desire. It is an immense and noble task. We who wish the Turkish people well must speak out that this is the great moment to regain honor. Right now, Armenians are struggling for their collective existence in the South Caucasus. My hope is that Armenians spend time processing the effect on them of experiencing so much collective trauma for so long, of its impact on judgments contributing to the recent tragedy, and to considering revisions of their self-understanding, supportive of their collective survival. While I think necessary, it is also very difficult to do, for when threatened on the outside, it is hard to move inside. Next slide, please. By contrast, the Azerbaijanis are ruled by an authoritarian who has long spent much of the country's dwindling oil revenues on weapons rather than its people, making Azerbaijan much stronger militarily than Armenia. That money also buys international influence of the country's numerous military suppliers and investors, as this slide shows. Azerbaijanis do not enjoy freedom of speech, and the country is currently way outside international law in its outrageous treatment of Armenian POWs. But there are Azerbaijanis who, with their Armenian neighbors, would like to pursue cooperation and democracy for all. Some Azerbaijanis already courageously meet with Armenians, reflecting the hopes found in their own more liberal culture in the early 20th century. If sufficiently large numbers of each people invest in dialogue and build mutual trust, they might be able to avoid the repetition of massacring, ethnic cleansing, and self-generating mutual hatred. This is a discouraging time, but perhaps not hopeless. Evolving techniques and conflict resolution practice could, with sufficient goodwill and continuing attention from outside powers, such as Biden's move, make a difference. In conclusion, I note the traumas of habitual fighting and vast destruction have not blinded elements of the two peoples in their love of their environment, and perhaps the need to preserve it together in order to preserve a future for all. Next slide, please. I see a reflection of this love, in a pair of postage stamps, one Azerbaijani and one Armenian, of the same breed of Karabakh horse. The Azerbaijani one shown in its unbounded, pristine natural setting. I cannot believe it illusory. To see here a powerful symbol of the necessity of learning how to conflict productively for both their futures. Thank you very much for listening. I greatly look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. Trying to get my video on. Sorry, excuse me, Pam. Wait 1 second. I'm trying to get my video on. All right. There we go. Yes, well, Pam, thank you for that very impactful and insightful presentation. It's a lot. Let's face it, it's really a lot. And I think you've articulated it in a way that's new. And, I think the idea of focusing on collective trauma is going to really inform, let's hope it can inform some decision-making at the policy level. So keep our fingers crossed on that, Pam. But we have some questions from the audience.
Great.
And one person is asking, this is Laura Hogue. She said, will it be possible to say something about long time versus short time trauma? For example, inherited traumas. Can you kind of make some distinctions for Laura there on that question?
Well, unprocessed trauma that is great is transmitted in many different ways, and it's many different kinds of trauma, but particularly humanly caused trauma has a long-term effect, including across generations and across space as well. And very often in some research, it's been shown that one person, one child or one grandchild of the original trauma survivors often becomes the sort of person who carries that trauma more than other members of that family. But it's surprising that more or less everybody can feel it and feel the trauma symptoms in certain respects and become activists. That's very common.
Oh, and related, Nisar is asking, what are your thoughts about the physiological impact of inherited trauma and approaches like the book, It Didn't Begin With You, but It Can End With You?
Well, it can. I mean, with collective trauma, inhumanly caused trauma, like these terrible genocides and ethnic cleansings and so on, you pretty much have to get herd immunity or huge herd healing. And that's why I'm proposing that collective trauma be taken on board in policy making for processing, and that processing is essential, a healing kind of processing. And there are methods for healing trauma. You would never, I don't believe that collective trauma is practically ever, at least in a few generations, completely healed. There are always memories, and that memories are important to human history. So that's important. And we all have emotions, and I happen to believe that emotions are what provides the energy that drives us to do whatever we do in life. So that's there. But on the other hand, people who are healed as much as possible from trauma can become healers, and usually do in one form or the other, or seek to become healers. So that's the kind of golden lining in traumatization, if it's not too horrendous, or even if it is. But to date, far more people have suffered horribly from trauma to which there hasn't been any real healing. You know, people can function magnificently well and be very traumatized. I have a very beloved, respected friend with achievements beyond imagination who was a child during the Holocaust, was very badly traumatized, and although he is as high functioning as you can find, has had traumas, has had nightmares his entire life, every night. So trauma goes on, but it hasn't affected his functioning on the face of it. You know, I don't know how it tortures him or not, but he's a wonderful man, an absolutely spectacular person in every way. So trauma affects people very differently.
Yes. Well, related, this next question by Naja, understand, she's saying, or he, the correlation of trauma, and thank you for this presentation. After using worldwide examples of genocide and trauma, can you touch upon the ongoing trauma of African Americans here in the US due to the ongoing psychological trauma induced by racism by their European counterparts? In addition, well, let's just go with that one. We want to address the trauma of racism, systemic racism.
Well, it's very, to my mind, it's enormous, just enormous, and it's very similar to what happened to the Armenians, very similar. However, an enormous difference, thank God, is that in this country, it's become, and over time, it has become far more possible to talk about it and work on it. And that is not true in Turkey. Most of this, or many of the serious dissidents in Turkey who have had tremendous courage, or not many, but yeah, many are in jail for speaking about it. It is a crime, jailable crime in Turkey to mention the Armenian Genocide, to use those words. And I wrote to friends in Turkey about my talk today. I wrote them an encrypted message. I was truly frightened that they could get, I mean, they've been under surveillance. Some of them have been called into court. One of them has been in jail on and off, or not on and off. He was in jail for 3 years and he never was told why. So the cultures, thank God, are very different.
But you do see similarities.
I see deep similarities, and to reading my book, I think people would see those similarities loud and clear. I mean, the lynching went on in Eastern Turkey, the theft of property well before the genocide, well before, I mean, in the early 1900s and before that, the abduction of women and so on. I mean, it all went on. The discrimination in cities, absolutely. It's a very old, terrible story.
And what do you think about gun violence in this country? The way that it affects, this is the second part of this person's question. And how about gun violence and the ongoing trauma, not just to African Americans, but certainly African Americans, but the ongoing trauma even to school children?
Yeah, well, that's a very great question. It is, and I don't know the answer, I mean, but I don't think it's good. I think it's terrible. It isn't good to be brought up to be afraid. And we do know that the effect of trauma is greater the younger you are.
Mm-hmm.
We know that, and that's shown in studies. And yeah. And in terms of guns themselves, in Eastern Turkey, as in the South in this country, where law enforcement is less than it is in other places, violence is greater. And those are both cultures of honor. The South and the United States, or it was until recently, and I think it must still be. And Turkey is a culture of honor. And these things people are gun happier because they think they need to defend their honor very rapidly, make it go away, what they call insults to it.
Okay, Pam, thank you. Here's another question. This is John Abadian. Regarding Turkish pride, most Armenian survivor families have stories of Turkish friends and neighbors who saved Armenian lives. My own family has 2 such stories. Why are they not finding pride in these stories? I'm inspired by the story of John Rabe, a Nazi party member who saved thousands of Chinese lives in Nanking against a certain genocide by the Japanese. Why do the descendants of perpetrators put more weight on the shame versus the pride in these types of stories?
Well, it's a great question. And I think that Armenians are hated in Turkey under the surface. And just the way for people who feel their hatred for white people who feel their hatred for Blacks in this country would probably be ashamed if they had Black blood in their own families. But what he's saying is true. And I think to show pride about having saved Armenians and Turkeys begs the question of saving them from what, which entails the whole story. That may be part of it. And so also a Turkish person who wrote a book about having discovered that his grandmother in recent years was Armenian, had his family threaten to disown him. And Hassan Jamal, who is the very famous Turkish writer and journalist, who whose grandfather was one of the three most important rulers of the Ottoman Empire during the genocide, has written a book called The Armenian Genocide and speaks about genocide. And he said, when he first started to do it, I don't know if it's still happening, his family didn't want to speak of it and kept him at great distance. So not easy. And the man, this man who just asked the question has hit on something great to explore more.
Yes. All right, thank you, Pam. There's an interesting question here from Rahina. As I've read about an additional fear response referred to as fawn, which occurs only after the three fear responses, fight, flight, and freeze, don't work, and the fawning person becomes subservient to the source of the threat. What is your understanding of this, and how have you seen it? Have you seen it play out in your work?
It's another great question. But you see, the thing is that these, the fight, flight, and freeze all occur, as I said, instantaneously and involuntarily. And there's a brief moment when people's minds decide what of those responses they can act out to preserve themselves. What comes after that as a traumatic situation is ongoing, which this person is describing. You'd be fawning in an ongoing threatening situation. There are a million ways, or not enough, a million, but many ways that people are going to protect themselves. And fawning sounds like a fine description of that. And in fact, I do remember somehow learning this when we did our Israeli-Palestinian work, that the parallel is to servants in a household where there are servants. Servants always know much more about how to get around the master than the master has figured out about the servants. And that's a kind of fawning, to learn how to manage the more powerful. Fawning is a way to manage the more powerful in the relationship.
So Pam, I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm wondering if you think that collective trauma, what it requires for healing. So for example, does it mean that it has to happen at the individual level only, that the individuals have to do the work? Or is there, but perhaps is there a role for the larger community to play in the healing process, like a forgiveness or an acknowledgement? Let's say acknowledgement. I'm not talking about, sorry, forgiveness was the wrong word. What I'm asking for, is there a need for public acknowledgement?
I believe so.
Of the suffering, and where does that come from? Would that, yeah,
absolutely.
Say a little bit of that before we wrap up, because I think people might be interested in
the
healing process.
Right. We don't really have an answer to that. We do know that trauma work can be done much more rapidly than it used to be, because by engaging the body in the work, because the body has the symptoms, as Bessel van der Kolk entitled his book, The Body Keeps a Score. So there's no reason why we can't evolve without that much trouble, and some people are doing some of it, in large groups of people getting in touch with what's going on in their bodies and processing it. And there have been many group experiences that can do this. We have to completely throw out this rubbish, really, about being allergic to anything, quote, touchy-feely. We all are full of feelings. And when we deny them, that's what we're doing. We're just denying it. The feelings are part of it, but it doesn't mean we have to think. We need our best. And in my book, I really go into all kinds of large group possible processes to be adapted. But there are a million problems with the proposals I made, but I am convinced that with goodwill a bunch of conflict resolution people getting together can work them out, because we are wasting our time in our processes not addressing and including dealing with the collective trauma.
Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, isn't it, Pam?
This, I thank you. I think that's a good way. Yeah.
So we have run out of time, and I'm sorry for those of you who asked questions, but I couldn't get to. But I do want to thank you, Pam, very much, Dr. Pam Steiner, and also thank all the participants, everyone who registered and everyone who's here. We really appreciate your presence. And again, if you want to check in a couple of days, the POWEN website, you'll be able to find a recording of this event. So thank you, everybody. Thank you to the Weatherhead Center, to the Program on Negotiation, and thank you again, Dr. Pam Steiner.
Thank you so much.